Okay, welcome to a video that I've been wanting to make for a while now. We're at a bit of a lull now for Star Trek. We just finished Strange New World Season 2, which was awesome. And from the time of recording this, we're a couple weeks away from Lower Decks Season 4, so I thought I'd take this chance to talk about the movies, which I haven't really done on this channel at all, except for itty-bitty hints here and there about my opinions of them. So I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do a ranking. I've rewatched all the films in preparation for this, and some of them have really gone up in my opinion, and some of them have rotted really poorly. But I think my opinions may be slightly controversial here and there, but I think this should be fun regardless. So let's get into it. So I have to admit, it was a little difficult to pick the bottom spot for this list. There were a couple films that were sort of sparring for number 13, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to my enjoyment of the films, and I enjoy this film least of all the films in the series, and it's Into Darkness. This is one of the films that has really soured for me over time. I really liked it when I first saw it in theaters in 2013. Granted, I was only 13 years old, so I wasn't looking at it through a very critical lens. And as an action film, it's perfectly fine. But as a Star Trek film, like the first two Kelvin films, not Beyond, are very poor at adhering to what Star Trek is, though they're entertaining. I will give them that. Into Darkness just feels extremely derivative, and everybody said this. It feels like a poor remake of Wrath of Khan, and it is. And unfortunately, I feel that everything that's done that is derivative is done more poorly than the original, with the exception of Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan. I think it's almost inarguable that he's a great villain. He's a great actor. I think he's great in this movie. Whether he's a great Khan, that's probably up for debate. Personally, he worked for me, but he's nothing like Ricardo Montalban, who gives a very over-the-top campy performance. Benedict Cumberbatch gives a much more serious performance, but they both work very well as intimidating villains, but they definitely don't feel like the same character. But nevertheless, I think Cumberbatch is probably the best thing in this movie. Everything else just falls pretty flat for me. The story is pretty crap, I've got to be honest. Peter Weller is
Well, shit.
pretty entertaining as Admiral Marcus, but I just don't find him to be a very interesting villain at all. He just wants to start a war with the Klingons because he thinks it's inevitable, so he wants to start it up now while he thinks Starfleet has the upper hand, I guess. I do like the stuff on Kronos. That's cool. I love the scene with Khan wasting the Klingons, and I like the Klingon design too in this movie a lot. But yeah, everything else around it, it just feels really uninteresting. The USS Vengeance and that whole thing with the super big ship is just really stupid. The finale with Spock just kicking the crap out of Khan is satisfying, but really out of character for Spock, really, I think. And the switching of the Khan thing, it just makes me roll my eyes now. And as a kid, I was like, oh, look what, I know what that is. I know what that's a reference to. But now I'm like, come on. It just doesn't feel like the logical next step, or maybe it was the logical next step for the Kelvin crew, but it doesn't feel natural. It just feels like we're doing the second film, let's do Wrath of Khan again. And for me, it just doesn't work. That being said, of course, the Kelvin timeline cast are phenomenal. Every scene that they're in together, it always works because they're a phenomenal cast. I'll talk more about them with the 2009 film, but nothing against them. They're great. Just the movie that surrounds them is really not. So next up, we have the film that almost made it at the bottom, but was just edged out by Into Darkness. It's Star Trek Nemesis. Now, this is a film that has definitely gotten a lot better with age, but mostly because of Star Trek Picard, Season 3, that has healed a lot of the wounds that was left by Nemesis. But it's hard for me to talk about this film without talking about Star Trek Picard, and really I should try to judge it based purely on itself. But that's really hard to do when you're talking about franchise films like this, where everything's intertwined. So I am going to think about it retroactively with Picard involved. And because of that, I actually think Nemesis is not that bad. I know a lot of people put it at the very bottom of their list, and I get it. There's a lot of really weird stuff that does not work at all. I think Shinzon is a villain. Tom Hardy's a great actor. Shinzon for me feels very hollow, though. It just feels like a very vanilla villain. I think a lot of that could have been solved if they just gave us more about Shinzon's backstory. I know we learned about his backstory, and I actually think it's very cool about how the Romulans cloned Picard, and they had this whole plan to infiltrate Starfleet, but that all fell through, and they just threw the boy on Remus, and then he grew up to become Shinzon. That's a great concept, but the problem is you don't really see a lot of Shinzon's childhood. And I think if we did, maybe we would have made we maybe would have been able to make a stronger connection with the character. Because right now I think there's nothing really there. There's no substance. So I think, yeah, if we had those little bit of sprinkling of drama, of his history, we could feel maybe a more tangible connection to him. But I don't know. As it is, he just doesn't really work. I think there's a lot of really strange scenes in this. It's a very dark film. It's by far the darkest Star Trek film. Obviously, the scene with the Viceroy, played by Ron Perlman, and Troy, where he's in her head, makes me really uncomfortable. I hate it. It's just a very strange scene, and the whole tone of the film is extremely dark. And I think that's really a detriment to the film, because there is jokes, but the levity doesn't really land, and it just sort of feels very dour the whole time. And that's just cemented by the ending with Data's death, which of course at the time everybody hated. And a lot of people still hate it. For me, because of Picard, which we have an actual satisfying conclusion to Data's story, this doesn't feel as bad, because this Picard to Nemesis was what Star Trek 3 was Star Trek 2. It sort of undercut the sacrifice, but it justified it almost. So I think because they were planning, or they were hoping to get another film after Nemesis, and they didn't get that, as a result, we just got the first half, and we never got the second half until 20 years later. So now that we had the second half, I can look at Nemesis as a whole as not as bad. But on its own, the Data sacrifice, I think, does not belong in the film whatsoever. I get what they were doing, but it just makes you feel so bad at the end of the film, and you leave the film feeling so distraught and depressed. But there are some good things in this movie too. The strongest part of this film is easily the battle in the Basin Rift, and I think that might be the best battle scene in the entirety of Star Trek. I love it. It's visually great. Tactically, it's really cool. I think it's an awesome fight. Really, a highlight of this film and a highlight of the whole series, frankly. But yeah, everything else I like. I wish we got more of Riker on the Titan, but that's obviously teased at the end. But yeah, this film just feels very unsatisfactory for an ending. And it's funny because they did market this film as the ending for the TNG crew. So maybe but they were hoping on getting another film. And certainly they were setting up B4 to become Data. I mean, there's no denying that. I don't know, maybe they were just hedging their bets that they would get another film and setting it up so maybe that they would convince Paramount to give them another film, but it didn't work. But thank goodness we have Star Trek Picard now to remedy that whole situation. And I think, yeah, Nemesis is really not that bad as people think. So in the 11th place, we have another situation with 10 and 11 where these films can kind of flip-flop for me depending on my mood when I watch them and a few other variables. But in the 11th spot, we have Insurrection. Insurrection is a film that I feel is pretty inoffensive and just sort of is there. I know a lot of people think it sucks. I think it's fine. I think a lot of people complain about it just feeling like an elongated episode of TNG, and I totally agree. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though. I think for sure it lacks a lot of the cinematic qualities that First Contact had, the previous film, and maybe that's why it does feel like a TV show episode. But if I'm just looking at it for the enjoyment factor and not necessarily what I expect from a movie, it's a good time for me. I think the story is okay. I mean, it's classic Star Trek with the Prime Directive thing, and they create some good tension there. I like the politics of Starfleet and the Federation Council and all that. I think that's pretty cool stuff. And the villains, Ruafo, not great. F. Murray Abrahams is another phenomenal actor, and I think he's definitely wasted also being under all that makeup, which was a weird choice. I understand they're supposed to be really old, but the Baku look exactly like humans, so, and the Sona and the Baku are the same species, so they could have worked around that probably and just made him look a lot older and didn't look so disgusting. And those awful scenes where their skin's being stretched and their teeth are being pulled and put in, and that's horrible. Like sort of body horror stuff, that always grossed me out. The story with the Sona and the Baku, okay. I think I like the tension with the familial thing with when the Sona and the Baku reunited. Ruafo's right-hand guy, he ends up sort of turning his back on Ruafo. That's all pretty good. The story with the metaphasic radiation, that's the fountain of youth thing, fine. I think it's perfectly serviceable. A lot of this film, the action is pretty bland, I have to be honest, and the CGI is really not so good in this film. I don't know if it was ILM that did it. I think this was the transitional period into more CG, effects, and it shows. Yeah, it just doesn't look as clean as First Contact, which I think was also using some CG, but most of it was model work. But First Contact looks pristine even today. But Insurrection has some scenes that really stick out. Probably my favorite scene, that starts off really strong and just lands horribly is the battle in the Briar Patch. I think the whole Riker maneuvers thing is really cool. Obviously, the joystick is excruciatingly stupid. I will succeed to that point because there's no defending it. But everything else around it's really cool. That's probably my favorite scene. I like Picard's love interest too, whose name I can't remember, but she's played by Donna Murphy. I think the idea of Picard dealing with his age is an interesting thing. And a lot of times with the TNG films, what they do with Picard's story and have him facing sort of facts of life, I think they're always pretty good. And I think this film does that fairly well. Him facing the fact that he's growing old, and all this stuff with Riker and Troy. I like that this rekindled their relationship because in the future how things carried out I like a lot. And Geordi getting his eyes back, all that's very interesting stuff I think. And but to be honest though, they should have just evacuated those people. I think it was 600 people.
How many people does it take, Admiral, before it becomes wrong? 1,000? 50,000? 1,000,000? How many people does it take, Admiral?
I mean, the metaphasic radiation could have saved countless lives. So I kind of do side with Admiral Dougherty, who's also a great actor. Anthony Zerbe, I believe, is the actor, who's also been in lots of other franchises. He was in License to Kill, in Bond. But he's actually a pretty good character, and I like he has a bit of a turn at the end where he sort of sides with Picard before he's killed, and his death scene is gruesome. But yeah, I think that there's some good stuff in this movie. It's just pretty flat lines for me personally. I don't think that makes it bad like a lot of people do. I think that just makes it okay. Not offensive to me, but definitely not one I run to very often. So coming at number 10, we have a film that for a long time I never really gave a second thought to. I always thought it was my least favorite actually of the TNG films, but now it's my second favorite. It's Generations. Generations is a film that I think was extremely ambitious, but really does not follow through with its ambition. The idea of having the Kirk and Picard team up is really, really cool on paper, and it's a nice, transition and passing of the torch between the generations. Such a cool idea. It wasn't really utilized that well. I just don't really think William Shatner and Patrick Stewart have that much chemistry, even though they're both great actors, they're both great captains. I don't know, it just doesn't feel, and when Kirk's brought into the future, he just feels so out of place, even though he's only ever on Viridian 3. It just feels very strange to me. Kirk, really, that whole element can just be removed from the film. I think he doesn't really add that much to it. Yes, it's great, it's nice to see him back, but for me, Star Trek VI is the perfect ending for those characters. I did not need to see them anymore. And seeing him, Kirk, Scotty, and Chekhov together on Enterprise B it's just weird that it's not the original trifecta. I know it was supposed to be Kirk, Spock, and Bones originally, and DeForest Kelley and Leonard Nimoy pulled out for some reason. They didn't like the script or something. But it really shows. Just having those three together, it's very bizarre, and it doesn't really work. While Kirk's sacrifice is heroic, it's totally unnecessary. And I think him dying on Viridian 3 after falling off a bridge or whatever.
Oh my.
I would rather not know about his death and just have Star Trek VI be the ending. So I think that, like I said, that's a perfect ending for the crew. But there is a lot of stuff Generations that's good. I really love the opening, not the Enterprise B stuff, but after the stuff on the ship with Worf being promoted. That's all very fun, I think. And it involves Data.
Learn to be spontaneous. Live in the moment. Do something unexpected. Get it? Good.
Data's now, I love what happens with Data with the emotion chip. I think that's very interesting, and it leads to one of my favorite scenes, a couple of my favorite scenes in the film, which are the Mr. Tricorder scene and the scene with Spot at the end where he starts crying. That's all really good. And any time that Brent Spiner gets to shine, I think is an A+ for me. I just love when that happens. And also, I mentioned before, Picard's arcs in the movie. Picard's stuff here is great, and the stuff with his family being killed in the fire at Chateau Picard is really intense. And that scene with him, with Picard and Troy in the ready room, it's intense, and I really like. It's obviously very appropriate that they have the idea of Picard facing the fact that he's going to be the last Picard, the last generation, in the film called Generations. That's a very interesting plot line to introduce, and I think it works. And of course now, Picard is not the last generation. Picard the Picard name, well, maybe not, the Crusher name. The Picard name through Crusher will continue. Maybe Jack will one day adopt the Picard last name, hopefully. But yeah, so this film, I think Soren is a very forgettable villain. Malcolm McDowell, again, great actor, but nothing, I don't care at all about his what's driving him. I mean, the fact that he wants to get back in the Nexus for purely personal reasons, purely selfish reasons. I just don't, I don't have any pity for him. I just don't care about him. He's just purely a blank villain. I wish there was a more interesting villain that for the Picard and Kirk big team up to defeat, but it's just Soren who's just pretty weak. Also, I hate the destruction of Enterprise D. It's a cool sequence, but the fact that it's the way it's taken out by the Duras sisters, who I've never been a fan of, and it's just, they have Geordi as a spy and they get the shield modulation, they could shoot through the shields. That should have been fixed really easily by rotating the shield modulation. That's really stupid, so I hate that whole thing. But obviously, again, thanks to Star Trek Picard, the Enterprise D came back. So, man, Picard really saved a couple of these films for me. But yeah, Generations, I think it's more ambitious, and purely for that, I do rate it above Insurrection, Nemesis, and it doesn't fall as flat as those two films for me. It's a pretty entertaining watch all around. So next up, we have the first TOS film we're going to discuss. And honestly, this is definitely going to be a controversial one, but it's pretty easy for me to pick my least favorite of the original series cast films. It's the motion picture. Now, there's a lot of stuff about this film I really appreciate. I really appreciate how classic sci-fi it is. The very slow building plot and everything is paced very slowly. There's almost no action in the film. And I think in comparison to its peers of the eras, Star Wars came out 2 years before, which was obviously it's an action film at its core. To have a film like this was definitely an ambitious thing to do. Personally, it just makes it a little boring for me. I find pretty much everything with V'ger to be quite bland. It's not. I was going to say he's not an interesting villain, but he's not really. It's not a person. It's something they have to thwart, but it's not an individual. The idea of the Voyager 6 probe being sent out to space and an alien species picking it up, I think that's actually pretty cool. I would have actually liked to have seen more of the alien species if they made contact with the humans afterwards. That would have been cool. But as it stands, it feels kind of like it's not satisfied and not resolved with V'ger. I know a lot of people have talked about maybe it was the Borg that got the Voyager 6 probe, but I think no. I think that wouldn't really line up, I don't think. The best part of this film, hands down, is what happens with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, because their relationship is very, coming from TOS to this, it's so different because they've been apart for a long time at this point. Spock at the beginning is going through his Kolinar ritual, which I think is really cool to see, even regardless of the pretty obvious matte paintings in the background. All that's really good, and the idea of Spock becoming more open as the film goes on and after he mind melds with V'ger and all that, I think that's really cool. They all give great performances here, especially Shatner gives a really good performance as Kirk because he's really determined to get back into the captain's chair, and he's sort of itching for that sense of youth once again, and I think that works. And it creates some nice tension with him and Decker. And I like all that a lot. I think it's really entertaining character-wise, but the actual film around it is pretty dull, in my opinion, pretty slow. It just doesn't really have a lot that draws me in. Also, two big positives: the score, Jerry Goldsmith's first score for the films, which is phenomenal, and the visuals. I-11's visuals are outstanding. And with the score, I should also mention that the previous films, Nemesis has an amazing score, Insurrection has a great score, Generations has a pretty good score, Into Darkness is fine. But yeah, pretty much every Jerry Goldsmith score I can't really say anything bad about. They're all unique, and they all have really phenomenal pieces of music in them. So yeah, those are definitely some positives for this film. And the positive that it was the first Star Trek movie. I mean, it launched the cinematic Star Trek franchise, and we should be grateful to it for that, even if I don't necessarily love watching it. I still appreciate it for that. So at number 8, we have a film that I just love to watch, but it's quite low on this list because I just think it isn't really very, very Star Trek, and that's Star Trek 2009. Like I said, it's such an entertaining film. It's a great action film, a great space adventure film. It just doesn't feel like Star Trek. Yes, it has Star Trek characters in it, but it has none of the Star Trek elements that we're used to. The boldly exploring the first contact with alien species. It's just war and action. It's nice to see the characters interacting, and obviously they're meeting in ways that is different to how the regional timeline works, and it was smart of them to set up a separate timeline. I find all that very interesting. But there's a lot of stuff that doesn't line up, even if it's in a separate timeline, because the diversion happens with the Kelvin incident, but it's fine. But the Kelvin incident with Chris Hemsworth as George Kirk and all that, that's a phenomenal scene. Probably the best opening in the entire franchise. That is incredibly powerful and emotional, and it just is an amazing way to start the movie. I remember seeing this film, I was 9 years old seeing this film in theaters when it came out, and I saw it a couple times. And it was very much responsible, at least partially responsible, for my love for this franchise, even though I had seen TOS with my father and so on. But yeah, this really made me like, okay, wow, Star Trek is not just this 60s TV show, it's this whole franchise, and it opened my eyes. But even though now I think it's not very Star Trek, I think it's a great gateway film for people that are not familiar with Star Trek. You sort of tease them into the franchise. But like I said, it's really not super authentic to like the Roddenberry's vision of Star Trek. Eric Bana as Nero, super bland villain, I think. I do like the time travel thing is fine. Him coming back in time with Spock. Of course, Leonard Nimoy in this movie, incredible. Every scene he's in is fantastic. He hasn't lost, when this movie came out, he hadn't lost a bit of it. He was still spot on as Spock. But Nero, I find, is just so bland. He's just this angry, generic Romulan. But yeah, the destruction of Romulus itself is an interesting story plot, and I like how it's now been used in canon with Picard and all that. I find that to be quite smart, how they've used it since. But the whole, the fact that Romulus couldn't be evacuated in time and it came out by surprise is very ridiculous and stupid, and the scientifically it doesn't make any sense. The big threat of the supernova destroying the galaxy, I mean, it's totally outrageous and it does not line up scientifically at all. But if you just turn off that side of your brain and you can just watch it for entertainment value, the entertainment value is there big time. Something I've always hated that I will never not hate about this film is Kirk being promoted from cadet to captain over the events of this film. That is just so unbelievably stupid. I cannot forgive it. That's the one thing about this film that still drives me up the wall to this day. The fact that they thought that was okay, why there wasn't like a time jump, at least a couple years, just something. But he goes from cadet to captain over the course of this film. From the beginning, he starts off as a cadet. The end, he's captain. It happens over like a couple days, maybe. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But that aside, that's just, I mean, it's a nitpick, but it is a pretty heinous one. But like I said, this film is still very entertaining, very enjoyable. I've seen it probably more times than most films on this list, because it's very easy to just hop in and watch. And for that, it gets number 8. Okay, so we're about at the halfway point of this list, and we're getting to films that I think are definitely the upper echelon of Star Trek films, in my opinion. And starting number 7, we have The Search for Spock. There are a lot of fundamental issues I have with this movie. I still don't really know how I feel about the fact that it totally negates the sacrifice that Spock made in Star Trek II, but I think I've sort of come to terms with it. And the fact that this was a response to that movie, because the outcry was so severe about Spock's death in the last film that they had to make him come back, I find that pretty funny. But honestly, the fact that the fans were so outraged, they were like threatening Nimoy and the producers, I mean, that's ridiculous. But I'm glad they brought Spock back, because the films would not have been the same without him. If he wasn't in the next however many films he's in, which is a lot, it would have been very bizarre. And it would have been, you would really miss the chemistry of the trifecta, I think. The Search for Spock, it just feels like, for me, it's just a gateway point between, or like a bridge rather, between 2 and 4, which are both standout films for me. 3 just sort of feels like the intermission, even though it has some very important things that happen. The destruction of the Enterprise, which I think is actually a very powerful scene. It's far better for me than the destruction of the Enterprise in Generations. I think it's very powerful because we've had so much time with the ship in the films too, not only just in the show. And I think it really works. The death of David, Kirk's son, I think is a very powerful scene, and I think it adding to Kirk's rage with the Klingons was a nice little element. The Klingons themselves, obviously Christopher Lloyd, he's great. He's a very memorable villain for me. And it's the first time we actually sort of see Klingon culture, because the Klingons were in TOS, obviously, and then in motion picture they had the new aesthetic. But here you actually see them interacting and their sort of hierarchy of command and stuff, their structure. And you get a tiny taste of their sort of barbarian culture, and it's interesting to see that. I think they're probably, I was going to say they're among my favorite villains of the franchise, but no, that's not true. They're just good. They're memorable, I think, mainly because of Christopher Lloyd. But yeah, I think they're very solid. All the stuff with McCoy sort of being haunted by Spock's Katra, all that's really good. I love the scene where McCoy's in like this sort of medical place, and Kirk comes in.
How many fingers do I have up?
That's not very damn funny.
Your sense of humor's returned.
The hell it is.
That's all really good. There's a lot of great humor in this film, and the whole scene with McCoy at the bar trying to get a ride to Genesis.
Genesis? Yes, Genesis. How can you be deaf with ears like that?
That's all very funny. And speaking of which, all the stuff on Genesis, visually really cool. I mean, some of it's not aged so well, I've got to be honest, especially towards the end when the planet's like burning and turning into like lava. It looks a little hokey, but most of it's pretty cool. And I like the whole scientific thing of the planet going through all these different seasons really quickly, and it's going through its life cycle very quickly. I think it's very cool. And Savick, here played by Robin Curtis instead of Kirstie Alley, and I think Kirstie Alley was good as Savick, but I think Robin Curtis is better as Savick, is better as a more effective Vulcan. Is she half Romulan too? Or that's Valeris I'm thinking of, I think. But I think Robin Curtis and David, they have really great scenes together. And it's very tragic when David's killed, and very impactful, I think. So the film, while it has some memorable stuff, I just sort of gloss over it a lot when I'm thinking about the films I want to rewatch, but it's definitely not bad by any means. It's actually quite good. So at number 6, we have a film that this is definitely going to stir up some issues with people. It's Star Trek V, The Final Frontier.
I gotta sit down.
Now, there's some stuff for this film I cannot defend. I 100% detest the whole plot with finding God at the center of the universe at Shakari. It's so stupid. Yes, it's a TOS concept. It was supposed to be a TOS plot. They made it into the movie. But it's just so hokey, and I don't find it engaging whatsoever. And the whole sequence at the end with God, or the being masquerading as God, is just so stupid and cheesy, and the effects look weird. By the way, the effects in this film, I believe the only film in the original, or any of the films, maybe, not done by ILM. I guess they were off doing something else at the time, and it shows. I can't remember the production company, the visual effects company that did the effects for this film, but they look really bad. Yes, it's 1989, but even comparing the previous film and the following film, they really stand out as being not as good, in my opinion. But the one thing that saves this film for me, and it makes it very rewatchable for me, is, like, I keep talking about this, but it's Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Especially in this movie, they have incredible chemistry. They have the funniest scenes together. They absolutely are the glue that holds this movie together, because everything else is pretty stupid. The whole scene at Yosemite at the beginning is great. The jailbreak and everything with them together, they're just so magical together. They really do save this film.
What are you standing around for? Do you not know a jailbreak when you see one?
There are some other strong points, though. The score, of course, Jerry Goldsmith. Lawrence Luckinbill as Sybok, a character who I guess we're going to see more of in Strange New Worlds in the future, which I'm looking forward to. But he's a character I think is again very cool on paper. Maybe not the most engaging villain, but he's not even really like a villain. But I do think he's played by a great actor who sort of saves that role. Again, when you introduce a character like him where it comes out of left field that Spock has a brother, because there's no history with this character, or we even know he existed, it doesn't really land. If he had been mentioned at all before, it would have helped considerably in me caring about the character and finding interesting drama between Spock and him. But as it stands, because he's just totally fabricated for this film, I don't find any strength in their connection there. Obviously, Shatner directed this film, and it kind of shows because it's very Kirk heavy, this film. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing because obviously Kirk's a great character, but it seems like Kirk is the focus of almost every scene. But yeah, it's not a bad thing. But there's the one scene that Kirk is not the focus of, is probably the best scene in the movie, is the memories scene where Sybok is showing Spock his birth and McCoy the death of his dad. Probably the greatest scene of DeForest Kelley in Star Trek. I mean, he just kills it in that scene. It's a very emotional scene. It's the first time, perhaps not the first time, but one of the few times we actually get a lot of character development, or quite a bit of character development for the TOS crew, because in TOS, there wasn't a lot of that. The movie certainly gave a lot more of that in the motion picture through this film, Star Trek V, but this film makes a conscious effort to back up, Spock's birth. We know Spock's backstory, but seeing his father there and him disappointed, so human, and seeing McCoy's father, I don't know if we ever learned about that before, but that's very effective, I think. And it does enhance the characters considerably. And Kirk going, I don't want my pain erased. I need my pain. My pain makes me who I am. That's all good stuff. And but of course that's good stuff peppered into the plot that is just terrible. The plot is just so bad, with Sybok basically starting a religious cult to find Shakari. Very, very bad. But again, the reason it's so high in this film is just because I find it extremely entertaining, partly because of how cheesy and stupid it is, but mainly because of the trifecta, which I think they're just so good in this film. I really can't express that enough. But yeah, a controversial pick for sure. So at number 5, we have a film that I think is pretty universally loved. I don't think I'll get a lot of shit for putting this so high, but it's The Voyage Home. Probably just the most laid-back and entertaining, harmless Star Trek film. It's like a family film. I mean, they go back to the 1980s, which I love seeing them. That's one of my favorite scenes where they're all there in San Francisco. You look like a cadet review, break up. That's a great scene. Everything that happens in the 80s is great. The whole fish out of water thing, I think, works exceptionally well. All the characters just are so funny in all those circumstances. It really works. And I actually think, though the plot is ridiculous with the whales, I think it kind of works with the probe. It's a very simple plot. The probe comes in, hey, we need to talk to whales, we'll go back in time. The fact that it's very easy for them to time travel is a bit nuts, even though they actually did that similar thing, slingshotting around a sun in TOS a couple times, I think. But yeah, I love, the whale plot is so insane that I find it very charming. There'll be whales here.
Admiral, there'll be whales here.
I find that I like the whole fact that pretty much a lot of the film is set on the bird of prey, which I think is really cool. Of course, totally different set than Star Trek 3, but I find it very interesting to see them in a different environment. And I love the sets; they look really cool. It's just cool to have a different ship for once. And at the end, we obviously get the Enterprise A with a bridge that we never see again because it got trashed after filming this film in the rain or something. But yeah, I love everything that happens in San Francisco in the Cetacean Institute of Sausalito. George and Gracie, all that's great. Jillian, I think, is a great character, and I wish we saw her again because they sort of left it open-ended whether she would return or not with, I'll see her in the galaxy and all that. I think her and Shatner have great chemistry, and all their scenes together, I really like their dinner scene when they're getting the pizza and the Michelobes. That's really funny. But the funniest scene actually is easily the the scene in the hospital. The doctor gave me a pill and I grew a new kidney. The doctor gave me a pill and I grew a new kidney. That's really good. That's a really funny scene. All the humor in this film, I think, is a highlight of the whole series. I think it all works very well, especially the fish out of water stuff. It's very, very funny. Spock with the Spock cursing, that is just so good. Double dumbass on you, and so forth. And the colorful metaphors, I should say.
All right, who the hell are you? What were you doing in there?
Yeah, speak up, though.
Attempting the hell to communicate.
Communicate?
They like you very much, but they are not the hell you're whales.
I suppose they've told you that, huh?
The hell they did.
Spock, where the hell's the power you promised me?
1 damn minute, Admiral.
For this film, it's just endlessly rewatchable for me. I think it's just extremely entertaining, and I love it. I've loved it since I was a kid, and I love it to this day. So next up, we have another film that's very, very widely liked. A lot of people put it at the top of their list, but for me, there's quite a few, or 3 that edge it out, and it's Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. I think this film is very, very solid, but I don't think there's a lot of stuff to me that really stands out and elevates it above some of the stuff that's going to come above it here. I think Ricardo Montalban is obviously iconic as Khan. He chews up every scene he's in. He's very good. But he never actually interacts with Kirk in person in this movie. It's all over the view screen or over communicator and so on and so forth. I wish there was a scene of them together, but everything with Khan is pretty great. I mean, I can't really deny that. Khan, obviously that's super memorable and iconic.
Buried alive.
But yeah, I like the whole story with Genesis. I find that to be very interesting, a very cool idea for a scientific idea for a weapon / scientific device. All that's really good. Well, obviously, we meet Carol Marcus in this film and her son David, who is also Kirk's son. And we recently had them mentioned in Strange New Worlds, and hopefully we'll see more of them. But yes, they totally come out of left field. Another thing that's just introduced in this film to add drama and tension. I actually think this works pretty well. Even though we'd never seen Carol Marcus before, it's believable. And I think it makes for some nice dramatic moments, especially the scene at the end with Kirk and David hugging. That's all really good. And it's even more poignant knowing what happens in Star Trek 3 to him. But yeah, I think overall they work really well together. All the emotions throughout the film are really strong. Spock's death is incredibly powerful, which makes it even more, it would make it more of a gut punch if he didn't come back in the next film, but that's fine. He does. Isolated in this film, it's very, very powerful. But yeah, the story, it's very simple. I mean, it's just a battle over the Genesis device, basically. Khan's out there, he steals the Reliant, which is a cool ship, by the way, and from Terrell and Chekhov, who are both the whole eel thing, the ear eels or ear slugs, whatever you want to call them, all that's very creepy and effective. Yeah, I think it's a good film, but I just don't find it to really be that, I don't find it to be that engaging. I think it's very good, but I can watch it. I don't just go running for this film. I don't know why that is. I guess I just find it to be not that fun, maybe. I mean, it's very dramatic and it's got that sort of battleship tone to it that I think a lot of people like, and the sort of submarine warfare. And it makes for some great battle scenes. Obviously, the battle in this film, phenomenal. But those are just sort of intertwined into the film that I think is just good. You know, I still think it's phenomenal. James Horner's score is really good. It's good in Star Trek 3 too, even though it's sort of a bit recycled a little bit in Star Trek 3. But here it's very good. The leitmotifs are very iconic. You know, that's very it's all very good. So that his score is definitely a highlight. But yeah, it's a good film. I just don't know how to say without. I don't want people to think that I don't like this film, because I do love it, and a lot of people think it's the best Star Trek film. But for me, it's good, but it's not the best of the best. So, coming in at number 3, we have a huge leap in quality from the last TNG film that I mentioned, which was Generations. We have First Contact, which is a film that I think is just phenomenal. I love First Contact. I love the story. I love the characters. I love the music. I love the villains and the Borg. I particularly love James Cromwell as Ephraim Cochrane. I love the intertwining of Star Trek lore here, and seeing First Contact with the Vulcans, for me, that's so cool. And the birth of what would become the birth of United Earth and the Federation and Starfleet, I think that's awesome. Yeah, the Borg, I love that this is essentially a horror film. There's a lot of scenes that when I was a kid really freaked me the fuck out. It really works for me, I think, and not for me, I think, for me for sure. The Borg are a very intimidating villain, and you feel the sense of urgency when they're taking over the Enterprise, sort of deck by deck, and I love that. The Borg Queen, although a lot of people have a problem with the fact that there even is a Borg Queen, because the Borg are a collective consciousness, why do they need a queen? But for me, because Alice Krige is so good in this movie, I can just put it aside, because for a movie, you do kind of need a central villain, so the fact that they introduced her as that, it works for me. And I think, like I said, she has a great performance. The secondary characters, like Alfred Woodard's character, Lily, a lot of people find her annoying. I think she's a little bit annoying at first, but I think as she goes on, she's great. And I love that scene with the Captain Ahab scene with her and Picard. Captain Ahab has to hunt his whale. That's all really good. And like I said, this is another instance, obviously, with Picard facing a personal issue. Here it's with the Borg, and even though he had faced the Borg since the Best of Both Worlds in TNG, you know, there are instances where he was facing them and he didn't really react very intensely. Here he's like, you know, smashing glass and he's freaking out. It's a different circumstance. Here all of humanity is at stake, and he's really he has a lot of pressure put on him. I think, in situations like, I guess Iborg and Descent, where he was also against the Borg, the stakes were a lot lower. Here, it's literally like Earth and humanity. So I think he's cracking a little bit. That's why you get scenes like him smashing the miniatures and the Tommy gun scene, the holodeck, which is also a great scene, I think. It just makes for a strong. It adds for drama, obviously. It's sort of a little bit synthetic for that, and they have to include that in the film. But for me, it works, and I think, yes, is it Lily the character that should be confronting him about this? Maybe not. Maybe it should be like Beverly or something. But like I said, great actors, so the characters really work for me. The action in this film is great. All the scenes on the Enterprise fighting the Borg are awesome. The Battle of Sector 001 at the beginning is so freaking awesome. I just love it. And the effects hold up, like I said, they hold up totally today. They still look pristine. It's just a great scene. The score, it could be my favorite of Jerry Goldsmith's scores. The theme is awesome. All the stuff with the Borg, it's very disturbing and unsettling, and it all works really well for me. Yeah, I love the Enterprise E too, by the way. I did like it more than the D. Now I probably like them equally. I like its slickness as more of a battleship, but I know that's sort of not very Star Trek, but I find that to be, it just looks stylistically pretty cool. So I think maybe my opinions from when I was a kid are still weighing me down on that front. But yeah, a cool ship and a great movie overall, I think. Okay, so the final two, the big two. Again, like I was struggling for the last two, I was struggling for the first two to pick which one I think is the best and which one I think deserves second place. But ultimately, for second place, I decided was Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. I think this film is the perfect send-off for the original series crew. I think it's incredibly smartly done. The huge allegory for the Cold War with the Americans and the Russians and the humans versus the Klingons, brilliantly done. And I love all the political stuff with it, and the fact that we know that at some point the Federation have to be at peace with the Klingons because we have Worf in TNG. But I think the whole plot with Praxis exploding and then the Klingons depleting their supply of oxygen, that's so cool. And the espionage element and the conspiracy element, I think, is really, really great. And I love seeing them unfold the mystery with the conspiracy in the Federation between Valeris and General Chang and Admiral... I almost said Admiral Marcus. It's Brock Peters. Admiral whatever. But yeah, it's just a great film. And I love the set pieces, the final battle against the bird of prey with the Excelsior Enterprise. So awesome. Repente, Iman in this film, she's awesome. Yeah, everything about this film it's so good for me. I think it really is. Also, aesthetically, the bridge of the Enterprise in this film is so good. It's so clean. It's my favorite bridge design easily. I love the green and blue computer interfaces. They're not LCARs yet of the TOS film era. They're so cool. And just the aesthetics of this bridge I just love, because Nicholas Meyer is back for this film. He likes to militarize Starfleet a bit, and seeing like the actual physical buttons that there are on the consoles and stuff, I just think it makes everything feel a bit more grounded, and I think for me that makes me more engaged, even though it is set 200 years in the future and it doesn't have to necessarily be realistic. It could be very fantastical, and I would still buy into it. But something about the tactility of the buttons. But I'm getting off on a tangent here. Yeah, the film for me just works every single way. The villain, General Chang, is great. Gorkon is great. The whole scene, the dinner scene, is great with the blue spaghetti. And the whole assassination on the Kronos 1 with this, in the white suits with the phasers. Love the phasers too, by the way. They're a cool design. Yeah, I think everything about this film really lands for me. I can't really think of a scene that doesn't work. I love the hearing with McCoy and Kirk. That's really great when they're in the court. Yeah, all that's really cool. I think it's such a strong finale, and I'm so glad that it exists, and I'm so glad that now the TNG crew have gotten their version of Undiscovered Country in Picard. It's very satisfactory, and I think the fact that Generations exists and we actually see Kirk's death and everything, for me, doesn't undermine the brilliance of Undiscovered Country at all, because I see this really as the finale for the TOS crew, and I think it works brilliantly. Okay, that leaves us with number one. The crowned number one spot goes to Star Trek Beyond. Now, I rated the other two Kelvin films little bit harshly. Obviously, Into Darkness at the bottom, and in 2009 sort of in the middle. But Beyond, I think, is far more authentically Star Trek than the other two Kelvin films. It gets Star Trek. I guess a lot of that has to do with Justin Lin, the director, and Simon Pegg co-writing it with Doug Jung? I can't remember his last name. But yeah, it has a totally different vibe than the previous two Kelvin films. And it feels much better. The characters work much better. Kirk is much more settled in his role as captain. He feels much more like the original prime timeline Captain Kirk, Shatner's Kirk. And he feels more believable as a captain, whereas he just felt like sort of a careless, he's that sort of careless playboy that he was in the first two movies, where he was just too young and totally inexperienced. Here he has like 3 years of their 5-year mission under his belt, and he feels like Kirk, and he feels like he's actually got some experience to him, and he's a bit more weathered. And that works very well for me. All the other characters are firing on all cylinders too. They all feel like their classic TOS counterparts. And the whole film itself, this is like Insurrection. A lot of people have compared this film to feeling like a long episode of TOS. And again, it works for me, especially considering the previous two films in the Kelvin timeline didn't feel like really Star Trek at all. Crawl, I think, is easily probably the best film of the Kelvin timeline, even though his performance maybe not as strong as Benedict Cumberbatch as Khan. But Crawl, I find his motivation much more interesting. The idea of him being from the Enterprise era, which I love all the intertwining Enterprise stuff in this film because I'm a huge Enterprise fan. And seeing the mention of Mako and seeing the NX class, the Franklin, and Crawl's mention of the Xindi and Romulan Wars, the smile that was on my face when I saw this movie the first time in theaters when he said that line was ear to ear. I was so happy to hear that.
I think you underestimate humanity.
I fought for humanity! Lost millions to the Xindi and Romulan wars! And for what?
I love that this is such a love letter to Star Trek for the 50th anniversary. And I love that they created 50 new aliens for the 50th anniversary. That's so cool. The fact that we get the Enterprise A at the end, which is a very cool looking ship. And I pray that we get another Kelvin film so we can see them all on that ship. I think it's just such a visually phenomenal film. Every single shot is just so pristine and it just works so well from a visual standpoint. The destruction of the Enterprise in this film, obviously the third film, like Star Trek 3, they got to destroy the Enterprise. I love the finale. I love Yorktown as a concept, and all again visually it's awesome, and I love the showdown on it. I think it's really cool. The sabotage scene, I could kind of go without it. I think it's so cheesy, but it's fun. Them surfing the sort of wave of the swarm. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek for me, but I appreciate its connection to the first film. But yeah, for me, this is a perfect anniversary present for the 50th anniversary. We got, obviously, Leonard Nimoy passed like a year before this film came out, and there's a beautiful tribute to him in the film, and we see the picture, the Star Trek V promotional picture that he has, that Kelvin Spock opens and sees. That's just such a nice little touch. Yes, does it screw up continuity? The fact that they look so different, who cares? It's such a strong moment there for and it shows, it proves to this version of Spock that he needs to stick on his path and stick, because he was considering leaving the Enterprise for New Vulcan. No, he understands now that he cannot give up the future that he has with these people, because it's going to define him and make him who he is. And that's a great character journey. I think all the character journeys in this film are very strong. Kirk sort of feeling like he's lost in his career and he doesn't feel like he's going anywhere, and he's just exploring the vastness of space and what is the end game of this. But he comes to terms with that there doesn't need to be an end. So yeah, I think this film, for me, it's just so watchable because of the visuals and the characters and everything. It just works for me, and it's particularly great compared to the previous two films in the Kelvin franchise. And I just think it's just such a great film, and I really do think it's subjectively the best Star Trek film. I know I'm sure a lot of people just don't agree with that. I get that, but for me, it's at the top of the list. So there we have it, my ranking of the 13 Star Trek films. I know I went off on a little bit of tangents here and there, but hopefully you enjoyed watching. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and please, please, please tell me your ranking in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions. Comment on certain points that I've made, what you agree with, what you disagree with. I want to hear everybody's opinions, because that's exactly why I'm making this video. I want to get the discussion going like I always do, but especially for this, because I think this is going to be a great thing to discuss. and usually we hardly have any negativity. So hopefully we try to keep as positive as possible. Yes, there's stuff to bash on, which I'm all right with, but I tried to be as positive and objective as possible with all these films. So hopefully you enjoyed. I certainly enjoyed making this. It was a great time rewatching all the films and reevaluating them. By the way, we now have channel memberships are an option. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot to offer as far as memberships go at the moment. Hopefully that'll change in the future. So if you do feel like becoming a member, you can. There's only one tier. Like I said, don't feel compelled to. You can also do super thanks now. If you just want to leave a donation or something, don't feel compelled to, I assure you. But if you're feeling super generous, go for it. I will be very, very grateful. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. Hope you enjoyed watching. Leave those comments, and I will see you in the next video.